The lock wasn't the worst part. It was the light. My porch light was on at 10 in the morning, like the house was pretending someone still lived there. I stood on my own front step in Columbus, suitcase in one hand, emergency passport in the other, and realized my key didn't fit anymore. 7 days earlier, my son had hugged me in a Lisbon hotel lobby and said, "Dad, I'll grab coffee. Don't go anywhere." When I came back upstairs, my wallet was gone. My passport was gone, and so was he. He thought I'd never make it home. He thought a 70-year-old man without money in a foreign country would simply disappear. But I did come home, and when I saw the envelope taped inside my front window, "Dad, this is for the best," I understood something chilling. This wasn't panic. It was planning. What my son didn't know was that I had spent 35 years working in municipal compliance. Paperwork has fingerprints. Dates tell stories. And he had made one mistake, just one, that would cost him everything. If you've ever trusted someone more than yourself, stay with me. Because the house behind that door wasn't the only thing he was about to lose. I used to tell people Ethan was my retirement plan, not financially, but emotionally. After my wife passed, the house felt too quiet, and he filled it with confident energy spreadsheets open on my kitchen table, talking about market timing and estate efficiency like he was doing me a favor by being born ambitious. "Dad, you shouldn't be handling all this alone," he'd say, tapping numbers into his tablet. I was tired then. Grief does that, it makes paperwork feel heavier than it is. So when he suggested consolidating accounts, putting the house into a trust for tax reasons, and setting up shared access in case of emergencies, I nodded. I signed. I didn't read every page. Tell me honestly, if your own son slides documents across the same oak table where you taught him multiplication, do you scan for betrayal? Or do you see the 5-year-old who once cried because he thought you'd leave him at kindergarten? Trust isn't dramatic. It's quiet. It happens in ordinary moments. That's why it's so easy to weaponize. What I didn't realize was that Ethan wasn't simplifying my life. He was restructuring it. Every account password updated. Every utility redirected. Every notification routed through him first. I thought I was gaining help. In reality, I was surrendering visibility. And once you can't see what's happening in your own house, someone else can rearrange it without you noticing until the day you're standing outside, key in hand, and the lock doesn't recognize you anymore. The trip to Portugal was his idea, and that should have been my first question. "You always wanted to see Europe with Mom," Ethan said one evening, pouring me a glass of wine I didn't ask for. "Let me take you. My treat." It sounded thoughtful, generous, healing. He booked everything himself, flights out of JFK, a hotel in Lisbon overlooking the river, even airport transfers. I remember watching him move confidently through John Glenn Airport, boarding passes on his phone, my details already handled. I didn't carry much cash because he said I wouldn't need to. "Dad, it's 2024, everything's digital." The first 2 days were almost beautiful. We walked narrow cobblestone streets in Alfama. He took photos of me near the water like he was documenting proof of devotion. On the third morning, my credit card declined at a cafe. He smiled casually. "Fraud alert. I'll fix it." He asked to hold my wallet so he could call the bank from the hotel room where the Wi-Fi was stronger. That night, he didn't return. At 5:12 a.m., the front desk clerk knocked gently and said my son had checked out. One-way flight. New York. My passport was gone from the room safe. So was my wallet. I stood there staring at the indentation on the mattress where his suitcase had been. That's when the story in my head changed. This wasn't abandonment in panic. It was removal by design. And if he planned this part so carefully, what exactly was waiting for me back home? The first night alone in Lisbon, I didn't panic. Not immediately. Panic wastes oxygen, and at 70, you learn oxygen is precious. I went downstairs and asked the front desk to check the room safe again, even though I already knew it was empty. The young clerk avoided eye contact when he told me my son had settled the bill and left instructions that I would manage the rest. Manage with what? I had no wallet, no passport, no access to my bank, because Ethan had insisted on two-factor authentication routed through his phone for security. I sat in the marble lobby watching tourists roll their suitcases across polished floors, and for the first time in my life, I felt invisible. Not robbed, not lost, removed. The U.S. Embassy took 3 days to issue emergency documents. 3 days of sleeping in a modest guest house, paid for by a sympathetic receptionist, who said her father once trusted the wrong person too. On the second afternoon, I borrowed a public computer and tried logging into my email. One notification caught my eye. Franklin County Recorder. Property transfer filed. Date submitted the day before we left for Portugal. I opened the attachment. My house address. My name. My signature. Transferred into a family trust, managed solely by Ethan Walker. The notary verification was dated 2 days after I'd already landed overseas. That's when something steadied inside me. He didn't just strand me. He needed me physically gone. And that meant whatever he did next depended on me not coming back. I didn't call Ethan from Lisbon. I didn't leave angry voicemails or send desperate emails asking why. If he believed I was confused, frightened, and helpless, then that belief was useful to me. The embassy staff helped me secure a temporary passport, but what they couldn't restore was access to my finances. Every security alert routed to Ethan's number, every recovery code tied to his email. I had never noticed how thoroughly he had inserted himself between me and my own life. On the flight back to Ohio, I replayed the timeline. Documents signed before the trip. Trust filed while I was overseas. Notary dated after my departure. That wasn't sloppy, it was overconfident. When I landed, I didn't go straight home. I went to Margaret Ellis. We'd worked together decades ago in municipal compliance. She now specialized in property litigation. Her office smelled like old paper and lemon polish. I placed the printed trust documents in front of her and said, "My son thinks I'm not coming back." She read quietly, lips tightening at the notary stamp. "Where were you on this date?" she asked. "Lisbon." She nodded once. "Then this isn't a family misunderstanding." She looked at me carefully. "It's fraud." Hearing the word out loud didn't feel dramatic. It felt clarifying. Margaret filed a temporary injunction before close of business that same afternoon, placing a legal freeze on any sale or refinancing of the property. No confrontation, no warning, just paperwork moving faster than he expected. And for the first time since that hotel room in Portugal, I felt something return to me. Control. The injunction went through faster than I expected. By the next morning, a notice of pending litigation was attached to my property title. It wasn't dramatic. No flashing lights. No officers at the door. Just a digital flag in the county system that quietly told every lender and buyer, "Do not touch." Around noon, Margaret received a call from a title company asking about a scheduled closing. Scheduled closing. I hadn't even stepped back inside my house yet, and Ethan was already trying to sell it. The listing had gone live 2 days earlier. Professionally staged photos showed my living room stripped of personality, neutral throw pillows, rented artwork. Even the navy armchair where I used to drink coffee was gone. My wife's china cabinet wasn't visible in a single frame. It felt like I was looking at a sanitized version of my own life, prepared for strangers. Margaret turned her monitor toward me. "He's moving quickly," she said. "That usually means he thinks he's safe." The list pendants froze the transaction immediately. Buyers don't gamble on family lawsuits. Banks don't finance disputed assets. The trap didn't snap loudly. It sealed quietly. That evening, my phone rang for the first time since Lisbon. Ethan's name lit up the screen. His voice wasn't apologetic. It was irritated. "Dad, what did you file?" I didn't raise mine. "Why is the notary dated after I left the country?" Silence followed, not confusion, not denial, calculation, and in that pause I understood something important. He hadn't expected resistance. He came to Margaret's office the next morning without an appointment. Ethan always preferred control, and walking into a room uninvited was his way of reclaiming it. He wore a charcoal suit I'd seen him save for important negotiations, jaw tight, movements measured. He didn't sit. He looked at me first. "Dad, this doesn't need to be public." Public. As if that was the problem. Margaret didn't waste time. She slid the trust documents across the desk. "Explain the notarization date," she said calmly. Ethan exhaled through his nose. "Clerical delay. The paperwork was processed later." "Not processed," Margaret corrected. "Certified." He shifted his weight. A small tell. "You told me to handle everything," he said, turning back to me. There it was again, that language. Helpful. Responsible. Framed like sacrifice. I kept my voice even. "I never told you to remove me." For a moment, something flickered behind his confidence. Not guilt. Risk assessment. Margaret tapped another document, travel records confirming my departure date. "If this proceeds," she said, "we petition for forensic review of the signature authentication and notary logs. That escalates quickly. The word escalates lingered in the air. Ethan finally sat down. Not because he wanted to, because he had to. "What do you want?" he asked me quietly. It wasn't an apology. It was a negotiation opening. And that told me everything. He still believed this was about leverage. He didn't understand yet that it was about consequence. "I want my house back," I said, and it surprised even me how steady my voice sounded. Not louder, not angrier, just clear. Ethan leaned back in the chair like he was recalculating. "It's in a trust," he replied. "For protection." Protection. That word again, always framed like he was shielding me from something I couldn't understand. Margaret folded her hands. "A trust doesn't remove the grantor without explicit consent," she said. "And it certainly doesn't authorize liquidation without fiduciary duty." Ethan's eyes flicked toward her, then back to me. "Dad, the market is peaking. I was preserving value. You don't need a 4-bedroom house." There it was, the justification. Downsizing disguised as strategy. And where was I going to live? I asked. He hesitated half a second too long. "We would have figured something out." I felt the shift then. Not in him and me. For the first time, I wasn't responding as a father protecting his son from consequences. I was listening, like a man evaluating risk. Margaret slid another paper across the desk, documentation showing he had already initiated escrow. "You attempted to sell disputed property while the grantor was abroad," she said calmly. "That demonstrates intent." The word intent changed the temperature in the room. Ethan's confidence thinned. He thought this was a misunderstanding that could be smoothed over privately. He hadn't prepared for documentation, and documentation doesn't argue. It accumulates. What Ethan didn't understand was that intent leaves a trail. After he left Margaret's office, she made 2 calls, one to the title company, another to the listing agent whose name appeared on the online photos. By late afternoon, we knew more than he expected us to. The house had been staged within 48 hours of our departure to Portugal. Furniture rentals billed to a short-term corporate account. Utilities temporarily transferred. Even the family photos had been removed before the photographer arrived. That meant he hadn't acted impulsively after leaving me abroad. The sale had been scheduled before we boarded the plane. I sat in Margaret's office, staring at the printed MLS sheet, noticing details only someone who had lived there for decades would catch: the slight crack in the hallway molding digitally edited out, the backyard cropped tightly so buyers couldn't see the oak tree I planted the year Ethan was born. "He anticipated your absence," Margaret said quietly. "He just didn't anticipate your return." That sentence settled heavily. I wasn't dealing with a son who panicked. I was dealing with a man who calculated timelines. That evening, Ethan texted instead of calling. "We can settle this privately." Not, "I'm sorry." Not, "I made a mistake." Settle. As if this were a business dispute between equals. I typed one sentence back. "All communication goes through counsel." When I pressed send, something shifted permanently. I wasn't just protecting property anymore. I was protecting reality. 3 days after the injunction, the buyer backed out. Not because of me. Because of uncertainty. Margaret forwarded me the email. "Due to pending litigation, my clients are withdrawing their offer effective immediately." Clean, professional, detached. That's how deals collapse without emotion. I wondered if Ethan had promised them a smooth close, a quick transfer, maybe even a story about an aging father transitioning to assisted living. It would have sounded responsible, strategic. That's what made this sting differently. He hadn't painted me as cruel or unstable. He had painted me as obsolete. Later that afternoon, Margaret obtained the notary's registry entry connected to the trust filing. The signature log didn't match the timestamp submitted to the county. The notary seal had been applied electronically after hours. "This," she said, tapping the page, "is procedural exposure." I asked her what that meant in plain language. She looked at me carefully. "It means if this proceeds to court, he won't just lose the house." That was the first moment I felt something close to grief instead of anger, because consequences don't scale neatly. They expand. That evening, Ethan showed up at the house. I watched from Margaret's car across the street as he realized the key no longer turned. She had advised me to change the locks legally once the injunction was filed. He stepped back, confused, then pulled out his phone. A second later, mine vibrated. I didn't answer. For once, he was the one standing outside. I let the phone ring, then stop, then ring again. From Margaret's car across the street, I watched Ethan step back from the front door like the house itself had rejected him. The new lock gleamed under the afternoon sun, installed legally, documented properly, every step advised. There's a difference between being locked out unlawfully and being denied access by court protection. He was experiencing the second. My phone buzzed with a voicemail notification. Then a text. "Dad, this is ridiculous." Another message followed quickly. "You're embarrassing yourself." That one almost made me laugh, because embarrassment requires an audience, and right now, the only witnesses were legal records and timestamps. Margaret lowered her sunglasses slightly. "He didn't expect you to assert possession. He thought I'd argue," I said quietly. "Not act. That's the mistake people make when they underestimate someone older. They confuse silence with weakness. They assume patience equals confusion." Across the lawn, Ethan tried the garage keypad. It beeped red. He looked smaller somehow. Not physically. Strategically. A few minutes later, he walked back to his car, sat inside, and stayed there for a long time without starting the engine. I wondered what narrative he was constructing now. Victim of an overreaction? Son betrayed by stubborn father? My phone buzzed again. "We can fix this. Just drop the filing." I didn't respond. Because here's something I've learned. When someone asks you to drop protection, it usually means it's working. 2 mornings later, we filed the formal complaint. Not a threat. Not a warning. A complaint. Fraudulent notarization. Breach of fiduciary duty. Attempted unlawful transfer. Margaret drafted it with the kind of calm precision that only comes from experience. No emotional language. No character attacks. Just dates, timestamps, and documented inconsistencies laid out in clean chronological order. Reading it felt surreal. My life reduced to numbered paragraphs. "You understand," she said gently. "Once this is served, it escalates beyond negotiation." I nodded. Escalation wasn't the goal. Clarity was. Ethan had framed everything as efficiency, market timing, equity protection, strategic restructuring. The complaint reframed it as intent. That afternoon, a process server delivered the documents to his downtown office. I didn't attend. I didn't need to see his face. But an hour later, my phone lit up with his name again. I let it go to voicemail. His message was shorter this time. No irritation, no accusation, just tension. "Dad, call me before this goes too far." Before. That word lingered. In his mind, this hadn't gone far yet. It was still reversible, still containable. But legal filings create momentum. They don't disappear because someone feels uncomfortable. Later that evening, Margaret received confirmation that the court had scheduled an expedited review due to potential fraud. That was faster than expected. When she told me, I felt something settle inside me. Not triumph. Not satisfaction. Just inevitability. And inevitability is far more powerful than anger. The hearing was scheduled for the following Tuesday. Expedited review. That phrase sounds technical, almost harmless. But in legal terms, it means the court sees smoke and wants to check for fire. Margaret prepared meticulously certified travel records, embassy documentation proving my presence overseas, metadata timestamps from the trust filing, and the notary registry discrepancy. Everything aligned too cleanly for coincidence. The night before the hearing, Ethan finally came to see me alone. Not at the office. At the house. He stood on the porch again, but this time he knocked instead of trying the handle. I opened the door but didn't invite him inside. Boundaries feel different once you enforce them. "Dad," he began, softer than before, "we don't have to do this publicly." Publicly again, as if visibility was the injury. "You left me in another country," I said evenly. "That was already public in my life." He ran a hand through his hair. I thought you'd just stay there longer. Maybe consider selling willingly." That was the first partial truth. "You miscalculated," I replied. He looked at me carefully then, maybe noticing the shift. I wasn't angry. I wasn't pleading. I was steady. "If this goes forward," he said, "it could affect my career." There it was. Not remorse. Consequence. I held his gaze. "You should have thought about that before you forged a notary." His shoulders dropped slightly. For the first time, he wasn't negotiating. He was realizing the cost. And tomorrow, realization would become record. Courtrooms are smaller than people imagine. Not dramatic, not cinematic, just controlled. Ethan stood at the opposite table in a navy suit this time, flanked by his attorney, a younger man flipping nervously through a binder that looked thinner than Margaret's single folder. That difference mattered. Not emotionally, Logistically, the judge began with one question. Was the grantor physically present in the state on the date of notarization? Margaret didn't embellish. She submitted my passport entry stamp, airline departure record, and embassy affidavit confirming I was in Lisbon when the certification occurred. Clean, chronological, undeniable. Ethan's attorney attempted explanation. Administrative delay in digital stamping. The judge interrupted. Notary logs are sequential and time-stamped. Silence followed. That kind of silence is different from hesitation. It's structural. It means something doesn't hold. Margaret then introduced the list pendants, the attempted escrow timeline, and the listing activation date all overlapping with my documented absence. It created a pattern, and patterns speak louder than single mistakes. Ethan didn't look at me during any of it. He looked at the table, at the grain in the wood, as if studying texture might rewrite sequence. When the judge announced that the trust transfer would be temporarily invalidated pending full investigation, I felt no rush of victory, just confirmation. Confirmation that documentation, when aligned properly, outweighs narrative. Outside the courtroom, Ethan finally met my eyes. "You're really doing this," he said quietly. I answered just as quietly, "No, you did." And for the first time since Lisbon, he had no reply. The temporary invalidation didn't end it. It shifted it. Once the trust transfer was suspended, ownership legally reverted back to me pending investigation. That meant Ethan's authority as trustee was frozen. Bank permissions tied to the trust were flagged. The escrow account he had opened was placed under review. It wasn't dramatic. No headlines, no public spectacle, just systems quietly retracting access. That's the thing about control built on paperwork. When paperwork collapses, so does leverage. 2 days later, Margaret received notice that the state licensing board overseeing notaries had initiated a compliance inquiry. They wanted digital audit trails, IP addresses, submission logs. Ethan hadn't just moved too quickly, he had left fingerprints and timestamps. He called again that night. Not defensive this time. Measured. "They're asking questions at work," he said. "Compliance questions." I could hear it in his breathing. The tightness. "When you file something official," I replied, "it becomes official." He was quiet for several seconds. "We can still resolve this privately." Or, there was that word again, resolve, as if truth were negotiable. "You tried to remove me from my own life," I said calmly. "This isn't about the house anymore." That landed harder than anger ever could. Because houses are assets. Trust is infrastructure. And infrastructure, once cracked, doesn't repair with apologies. The investigation would take weeks. But momentum had already shifted. He thought 7 days was enough to erase me. He hadn't accounted for what 7 days of documentation could build in return. The consequences didn't arrive all at once. They arrived in emails. First, the licensing board suspended the notary's certification pending investigation. That triggered an internal audit of every document processed through that office in the past quarter. Ethan's transfer wasn't just under review anymore. It was part of a broader compliance inquiry. Then his employer requested a meeting. He worked in financial risk management. Ironically, Margaret didn't need insider information to predict what that meant. "When your profession relies on fiduciary integrity," she told me, "allegations like this don't stay compartmentalized." That evening, Ethan asked to meet somewhere neutral. We chose a quiet coffee shop halfway between his apartment and my house. He arrived without a suit this time. No structured posture. No controlled tone. "They're putting me on administrative leave," he said, staring into his cup. I listened. "They think I manipulated documentation for personal gain." "You did," I replied, not harshly, just accurately. He looked up sharply. "I was trying to secure our future." Our. That word no longer included me. "You secured leverage," I said. "Not stability." Silence settled between us, thicker than before. For the first time, he wasn't defending the paperwork. He was confronting the outcome. "I didn't think you'd fight it," he admitted quietly. That was the most honest sentence he'd spoken since Lisbon. Not remorse. Calculation error. And in that moment, I understood something clearly. He hadn't underestimated the law. He had underestimated me. And that miscalculation was costing him far more than a house. Administrative leave became formal suspension within a week. Not termination. Worse, uncertainty. His firm issued a statement citing ongoing review of compliance discrepancies related to fiduciary conduct. polite language, heavy implication. In finance, reputation moves faster than facts. Clients ask questions before investigations conclude. Colleagues distance themselves before outcomes are final. He came to the house again, not knocking this time, just standing at the edge of the driveway like a visitor unsure of his welcome. I stepped outside. No lawyers, no documents, just us. They're freezing my access, he said. Email, client files, everything. I nodded once. That's what freezes do. He looked tired now. Not defeated, just recalculating with fewer variables in his favor. I didn't think it would spiral, he admitted. Spiral. That word suggested chaos. But nothing about this was chaotic. It was sequential. You filed something knowing I wasn't present, I said evenly. You listed the house while I was stranded. That wasn't a spiral. That was a plan. He swallowed. I thought you'd understand eventually. Understand what? That I was an obstacle? That removing me temporarily justified permanence? He looked at the house behind me, the windows reflecting late afternoon light. I was trying to optimize everything, he said quietly. I held his gaze. People aren't portfolios. That landed deeper than accusation. For the first time, I saw something different in his expression. Not fear, not strategy, recognition. And recognition, unlike negotiation, can't be outsourced. The full hearing was set for early spring. By then, the temporary invalidation had matured into something heavier, a formal civil proceeding. Discovery requests were issued, digital records subpoenaed, server logs traced. The notary, under pressure, provided a sworn statement admitting the certification had been processed remotely as a courtesy after receiving pre-signed documents. Courtesy? That word unraveled everything. Because courtesy implies awareness, and awareness implies intent. Ethan's attorney attempted damage control, arguing procedural misunderstanding rather than deliberate fraud. But intent doesn't rely on confession, it relies on pattern. The timeline showed preparation before departure. The staging invoices predated our flight. The escrow communication occurred while I was still overseas. It formed a clean arc. Remove, transfer, sell. When we sat in court again, the judge didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He referenced statutory language about fiduciary responsibility and material misrepresentation. The trust was voided. The transfer declared invalid. Further investigation into civil penalties was recommended. It wasn't dramatic. It was definitive. Outside the courthouse, reporters weren't waiting. No cameras. Just gray skies and quiet steps echoing off concrete. Ethan stood beside me for a moment. They're recommending disciplinary review, he said, almost to himself. I nodded. 7 days. That's how long he thought it would take to remove me. It took a few weeks to reverse it. But reversal isn't the same as repair. And some structures once exposed don't go back to what they were. The formal penalties weren't criminal. They were structural. The court ordered restitution for legal costs and referred the findings to the state's Financial Oversight Board. The notary lost certification permanently. Ethan's firm extended his suspension pending outcome of the regulatory review. In finance, that kind of language lingers longer than verdicts. The house, legally and cleanly, returned to my name alone. No trust. No shared control. Margaret insisted we review every account, every digital access point, every beneficiary designation. Passwords changed. Authentication rerouted. Authority clarified. It wasn't about revenge. It was about restoring visibility. Ethan asked to meet again, this time without agenda. We sat on the back patio under the oak tree I planted the year he was born. He didn't speak at first, just stared at the grass, like he was searching for a version of himself that made more sense. I thought I was doing what successful people do, he said finally. Move decisively. Secure assets. At whose expense? I asked quietly. He didn't answer, because this time the answer was obvious. 7 days. That's how long he believed it would take to erase my presence from the equation. Instead, those same 7 days became the documentation window that exposed everything. I never meant for it to go this far, he said. I believe that, not because he lacked ambition, but because he lacked restraint. And restraint, once lost, doesn't return easily. The house stood behind us, unchanged from the outside. But inside, something fundamental had shifted, not in the walls. In the distance between us. The regulatory review concluded quietly. No press release, no courtroom finale, Just a formal letter issued to Ethan's firm citing material lapse in fiduciary judgment. He was required to complete ethics remediation, pay administrative fines, and accept probationary reinstatement without client-facing authority for the foreseeable future. In his world, that was a demotion without using the word demotion. He came by one last time before returning to work under those restrictions. Not to argue, not to negotiate, just to stand on the porch that had once refused him. "I never hated you," he said, almost defensively. "I know," I replied. Hatred would have been easier to process. This was ambition without boundary. "I thought you were slowing down," he admitted. "I thought I needed to move before things got complicated." Complicated, as if aging were a liability clause. I looked at him carefully. "You moved," I said. "You just moved without me." That was the fracture. Not the trust documents, not the staged photos. The assumption that I was an obstacle instead of a person. He nodded slightly, like someone acknowledging math they can't dispute. The house behind me wasn't grand. It wasn't an asset class. It was memory layered into drywall. 7 days. That's how long he believed absence would create ownership. Instead, it created exposure. And exposure, once documented, doesn't fade. When he walked down the driveway that afternoon, he didn't look defeated. He looked altered. Sometimes losing a house isn't about property. It's about realizing you misjudged the foundation. The house is quieter now. Not empty. Just honest. I walk through it differently these days. I notice things I ignored before: the faint scratch on the hallway molding, the uneven cabinet hinge in the kitchen, the way late afternoon light settles across the hardwood floor like it's trying to remember something. Ownership feels different when you've almost lost it. Not because the structure changed, because your awareness did. Ethan and I still speak. Not often. Not casually. But we speak. There's a distance there that didn't exist before Lisbon. Not anger, not hostility, just caution. Trust, once fractured, doesn't regenerate like drywall. It rebuilds like bones, slower, thicker, never quite the same. He completed his remediation. He returned to work under supervision. He doesn't talk about optimization around me anymore. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I had panicked in that hotel lobby. If I had accepted the narrative that I was old, displaced, inconvenient. 7 days is a short time to erase someone unless that someone refuses to disappear. If you're listening to this and you've ever felt quietly pushed aside, remember something. Documentation matters. Presence matters. And silence isn't surrender unless you let it be. I kept the house, but more importantly, I kept my footing. And sometimes that's the only foundation that truly counts. If this story meant something to you, pass it along. You never know who might need the reminder, especially someone standing outside a door that used to open.